She looked at me like I was the answer to her prayers, and I couldn't stop thinking she might be mine. The first time I saw her, it was one of those ordinary afternoons that suddenly feels extraordinary. She was sitting at a corner table in the cafe I visited every week, the kind of place where sunlight fell in soft, golden rectangles across worn wooden floors. She had this calm, almost magnetic presence, like the world had slowed down for her and everything around her had softened in comparison. She looked up, and her eyes met mine for just a heartbeat. It wasn't a casual glance. It felt intentional, warm, curious. There was a quiet intensity in her gaze, the kind that makes you feel seen in a way you didn't realize you needed. My chest tightened for an instant, the air a little warmer around me. She wasn't staring in an awkward way. It was as though she recognized something in me that I hadn't recognized myself. I found myself holding the cup of coffee a little tighter, afraid I might break the spell if I moved too suddenly. She adjusted the scarf around her shoulders, the fabric brushing lightly against her neck, and I noticed a faint, comforting scent, something floral, soft, familiar yet new. My eyes wandered, taking in small details. The gentle arch of her eyebrows, the curve of her smile as she read a page of her book, the way her fingers traced the edge of the paper absent-mindedly. Every motion was graceful, deliberate, but effortless, like she had learned to move through the world without disturbing it, and yet everything around her seemed to shimmer just a little because she was there. I felt a pull I couldn't name, a mixture of curiosity and warmth that made the background noise, the clatter of cups, the hum of conversation, fade into a soft blur. I noticed the subtle play of light on her hair, catching shades of chestnut and gold, and the way her shoulders relaxed when she laughed quietly at something on the page. There was something about her confidence that wasn't loud or demanding. It was soft, steady, and oddly grounding. A few moments later, she looked up again, and this time there was a faint smile, a hint of acknowledgement. My heart skipped a beat, and I realized I had been staring longer than I intended. She didn't look away, though. Her eyes held mine for a fraction longer than necessary. And in that fraction, I felt something fragile yet undeniable, a connection that had no words but spoke volumes. As I sipped my coffee, I found myself replaying that glance over and over, noticing how her presence lingered even after she had returned to her book. There was a quiet magnetism in her attention, a subtle gravity that made me aware of her without any need for conversation. And I knew, even then, that this ordinary cafe afternoon had shifted. Something had begun, a slow, careful pull that neither of us would ignore. This first glance wasn't about fireworks or dramatic gestures. It was about the quiet spark of recognition, the kind that roots itself in your chest and refuses to let go. And in her eyes, I saw something I couldn't yet name, but I knew I wanted to discover, the sense that I might, somehow, be the answer she had been silently searching for. She looked up, and for a heartbeat, her eyes met mine. That same quiet intensity was there, that warm curiosity that seemed to pull me closer even before a word was spoken. My chest tightened again, not with fear, but with an odd comfort, as if her gaze had quietly acknowledged me, not just as a passing stranger, but as someone significant, someone she had noticed beyond the surface. Our paths converged naturally. She shifted slightly on the bench, and our hands brushed as we reached for the same book left abandoned on the side table of a nearby cafe she had come from. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me. There was a delicate tension in that brush of skin, a warmth that lingered long after our fingers parted. She didn't pull away awkwardly. Instead, there was a small, knowing smile that suggested she had felt it too, that silent recognition passing between us without a single word. We started walking together, side by side, though neither of us said much at first. There was no need. The rhythm of our steps seemed to synchronize naturally. I noticed the subtle ways she moved, the gentle swing of her coat, the way her hand occasionally brushed her hair back from her face, the soft inhale she took when a cool breeze passed. Every little gesture seemed to carry weight, a quiet grace that made ordinary moments feel charged with significance. She spoke then, her voice soft but deliberate, commenting on the park, the colors of the leaves, the faint hum of city life around us. And I listened, not just to her words, but to the spaces between them, the unspoken feelings that lingered in her pauses. She laughed softly at something small, a sound that was light, warm, and familiar before it had any reason to be. I found myself leaning just a little closer, unconsciously aware of the distance between us, aware of the pull in her gaze that mirrored the one in mine. In that shared space, something shifted. I realized I was no longer just noticing her. I was attuned to her presence, aware of how she moved, how she breathed, how her subtle gestures left impressions that settled quietly inside me. And I could tell she was noticing me, too. The way I hesitated before speaking, the small smiles that crept onto my face, the way I seemed to linger in the periphery of her attention. It was a gentle, unspoken acknowledgement that something significant was forming between us. No words could define it yet. It was delicate, fragile, and intensely magnetic. That afternoon, under the filtered sunlight and the quiet rustle of leaves, I understood the weight of that first glance all over again. It wasn't chance that had brought us together. It was the start of a connection neither of us fully understood, yet both of us felt deeply. The world around us continued its ordinary rhythm, but between us, something extraordinary had begun. And I knew, even without her saying it, that this was more than curiosity. This was recognition, quiet and unassuming, yet impossible to ignore. It was a quiet evening when I first saw her in a way that made me realize there was more beneath her composed exterior. We had met for a walk in the park, the kind of slow, unhurried stroll that allows conversations to drift into unexpected territory. The golden hour's sunlight softened the edges of the world, the air carrying the faint scent of grass and distant flowers, and yet all I could focus on was her. The way she moved, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted to the ground before meeting mine. She laughed at a small joke I made, but there was a brief hesitation in her smile, a flicker of something unspoken. I noticed it immediately, the quiet vulnerability beneath her poised demeanor. Something inside me shifted. It wasn't about wanting to fix her. It was about wanting to understand, to be present without rushing, without needing her to be anything other than herself. As we walked, she mentioned something about a recent challenge at work, her voice steady but tinged with a soft worry. Her fingers twisted a loose strand of hair around her hand, a small, unconscious gesture that made her seem both graceful and human. I reached out almost instinctively, letting my hand brush against hers in a supportive, careful way. She didn't flinch. Instead, she let the touch linger for a heartbeat, and I felt a warmth spread through me, not from desire, but from the quiet trust forming between us. There was a moment when she paused, looking at a group of children playing in the distance, and I noticed her sigh. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it carried a weight, a hint of exhaustion from life's constant demands. I wanted to ask, to ease that burden, but instead I just walked beside her, offering the comfort of presence. Our proximity was enough. Sometimes words weren't necessary. I realized then that the attraction I felt for her wasn't just physical. It was the depth of her humanity, the way she allowed herself to be seen in fleeting moments, the way she trusted me to notice without judgment. When she brushed her fingers lightly over my arm, or leaned slightly closer to hear me better, it wasn't casual. It was intimate, subtle, and meaningful. My heart raced not because of urgency, but because I sensed that something real, something fragile, was unfolding. By the end of that walk, I felt a connection that went beyond fascination. It was layered, complex, and entirely natural. I understood her hesitations, her moments of quiet self-doubt, and even her guarded optimism. And in her eyes, I glimpsed gratitude, a recognition of my presence, of my attentiveness, that made me feel quietly essential to her world. That evening, as we parted ways, she looked at me with a softness I hadn't seen before, the the kind of look that lingers long after the person has walked away. I knew then that this was no fleeting infatuation. This was a slow, deliberate weaving of two lives, a tentative trust that carried the promise of something deeper. And in that trust, I felt a warmth that wasn't mine alone. It was shared, fragile, and utterly compelling.